Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. We'll get started in just a moment. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, the 35th in the series. Thank you for joining me. It's really appreciated. And as I always say, thank you so much for all the comments that you put in. I can't tell you how much I appreciate them. One thing I would love you to do this week, if you're able to do so, I know that often I ask you to say where you're watching from and so on, and I really appreciate that. But I'd love it today if you could let me know what role these talks are playing in your life. I know for some people they're saying to me that it's making a difference when they're in lockdown, or it's keeping them busy. It's something to look forward to. I think some people watch while they're doing their ironing, and some people sit with a notebook. And so if you could let me, this is purely for my own interest, just to see what these talks are doing for people, if they're useful to you. And I know there's a lovely sense of community building up as well. So it's maybe that's important, or it's maybe that the information is. So if you could let me know, I would appreciate that, just out of interest. Before I go any further, just to remind you, as you'll be used to by now, that these talks are brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we would very much appreciate that. And thank you so much to those of you who have done that. You're really making a difference to our ability to be able to look after these amazing records and to share them with people. So thank you. Oh yeah, and contributing to your PhD, awesome. It's just really interesting to find the different reasons that people are watching. So thank you for letting me know. I've mentioned during the course of these series of talks that we're so fortunate in the Highlands to have such a wide range of landscape and communities. We have crofting communities, we have a city, we have fishing communities, all sorts of different ways of life in this area of Scotland. And so this week I'm going to talk about some of our island communities and some of the stories of people who live in our small island communities. And if you're watching from an island, please do let me know if you have an association with one of the islands in and around the Highlands and Islands. Please do let us know what that connection is. There are about 800 or 900 islands around the coast of Scotland, so really a substantial number. And many of those form part of the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, and the Inner and Outer Hebrides. So I'm laughing at Fiona's comment that this helps you to know that it's Thursday, because our weeks are all mad now. So many of the islands in Scotland form part of the Shetland Islands, the Orkney Islands, and the Inner and Outer Hebrides. And I know for the people who live in those island groups, there's no such thing as Orkney, and there's no such thing as Shetland. They like the Shetland Islands and the Orkney Islands, so I will make a point of saying that. There are around about 100 inhabited islands around the Highlands and Islands. And according to the Highlands and Islands Executive, there are the Highlands and Islands Enterprises, there are about 1/5 of the Highlands population live on an island. Some of them are very substantial. So for instance, Lewis and Harris at Skye are 600 square miles plus. So they're very substantial islands, and some are very much smaller. Islands have often held a sort of romantic feeling for people. There's an appeal for visitors that islands give a sense of refuge, a sense of escape, a sense of an idyllic, remote, rural place away. But I think we have to be very careful about using the word remote. Remote is absolutely a relevant term. It depends where you are, and if you're sitting in the middle of Glasgow or Edinburgh or somewhere, then the islands are very remote. But if your life has been spent on the island of Brassey, that's not remote. That's the centre of your existence. So we have to be careful about the word remote. But what they are is rural and sometimes isolated, and it depends. In the past, many more people have lived on the islands. The reality has been that emigration and different things have hit those populations, and so many of them have declined. And I'll touch on that a little bit as I go on. these have also been, the islands have also been traditionally areas of territorial conflict. They have been places of hard life fought over, and that's the same across the world, you know, where islands are quite often are fought over between different countries. And so that's the same for the islands around about the Highlands. There's been Norse conflict, been the Lord of the Isles, all sorts of different things. And so it's just remembering that although they can be beautiful and romantic and idyllic, there is a history there of a hard life. So first of all, what do we cover and what do we not cover? I've spoken several times over the weeks about the Highlands, and occasionally I talk about the Highlands and Islands. There's a reason for that, because it's all to do with the collections that we cover. So first of all, I'm going to tell you what we don't cover. If you're interested in the Shetland Islands, they have a fabulous archive in Lerwick. If you're interested in the Orkney Islands, they have a fantastic archive in Kirkwall, and they have the most phenomenal rivalry between each other. So if you want to have a look at their pages on Twitter, they're always good for a laugh. The islands off Argyllshire would be covered by the Argyllshire Archives, which are based in Lochgilphead. And these are the local authority collections that I'm talking about. Western Isles, the official records are held by the Western Isles Council, so that's in Tasclan na Neilan in Stornoway. But the Western Isles is an interesting one, and I'll come back to that in a second. There are also standalone and community archives. So for example, on the island of Kanana, they have the Kanana House archives. There are also the Common Yachries, which are the community archives around about the islands. So we have sort of local authority and official archives. There are also family archives, community archives, and all sorts of different ones. So there will be different places that hold the information. And the one thing I wanted to point out historically is that Lewis, the Isle of Lewis, used to belong to Ross and Cromarty County, and Harris, the Uists, and Barra, and so on, used to belong to Inverness-shire County. So when the Western Isles Council was created, in the 70s, the discrete records relating to those areas were removed to Stornoway, to the Western Isles, to the Tasclan na Neilan, but the overarching county records were kept with us, because they would be Inverness County or Ross and Cromarty County. They may have reference to the islands, but we would hold those, whereas the items specifically relating to an individual school, for instance, would go back to the Western Isles. So it's similar to when we opened our Skye and Lochaber archive, that Skye is also in Inverness-shire, so the Skye discrete records went there, but we held on to the county-wide records in Inverness. And so I want to tell you some stories from the island-related collections that we hold in each of our offices. And I'm going to start in the north in some records from Nucleus, our Nuclear and Caithness archives. And I want to thank so much my colleagues Valerie, Ailey and Catherine from each of the offices who have pinpointed some stories that they thought would be good to tell. So thank you very much to them for that. I'm conscious it's already 11:10. I've got so many awesome stories, so I may overrun a little bit, but I know from the past that you don't mind that too much. Okay, so we're starting in Nucleus and the island of Stroma. Stroma sits in the Pentland Firth between the north coast of Caithness and the Orkney Islands, and its name comes from the Norse for the island in the stream. And if you were watching last week when I was speaking about the Caledonian Canal, you will know that I mentioned the Pentland Firth as being a very, very dangerous area of shipping, a dangerous route, one of the most powerful tidal currents in the world. So a dangerous place to live in an island in the middle of the Pentland Firth. Stroma belonged to the county of Caithness and the parish of Canasbay, and it's 2 miles long by about 1.5 miles wide. Because it was in such a dangerous area, or of course still is in such a dangerous area, there were many shipwrecks and many ships had to take detours to pass around it. So it was they quite often had shipwrecks and salvage that they could live off. Census records are great when you're looking at islands because they show the fluctuations in population. And so for Stroma in 1841, the population was 186 people, 42 families. And then by 1881, it had moved to 341. So that's almost a double increase in that island's population over that 40-year period. The people in Stroma were very self-sufficient, as islanders tended to be, particularly so due to the sea conditions that I've described. they could be isolated for long periods of time, and so you had to be self-sufficient. And through the 20th century, the population gradually declined, especially post-war. And this is something we'll see as I go through all these stories I'm going to tell, that the impact of a changing world, the increase in communication with the outside world, and the decline of traditional livelihoods has a huge impact, particularly on these areas. And so eventually the last residents left Stroma in the 1960s. And if you have a look for the island online, you'll see some kind of sad and lonely images of cottages in decline. But the island was sold to a Stroma man, Mr. Simpson, and he farmed the island after the residents left. And in Nucleus, we have all sorts of records relating to Stroma. We have estate maps that show crofts and occupants' names, which is great. Some poetry, some plans from the Sinclair MacDonald Architecture Collection, photographs, and police records that talk about war incidents during the war on Stroma. But I wanted to focus on some of the oral histories that we hold. We have got some oral histories of people who used to live on the island of Stroma, talking about what life was like there. And my colleague Valerie in Nucleus has picked some examples for me to talk about. I'm going to try and group them into some themes of things people commonly mention. So memories of shops and shopping on Stroma. A ship used to come by fortnightly, and it was called the Floating Shop, and it used to visit from the Orkney Islands. And it was a huge occasion, particularly for children. You can imagine the excitement of the floating shop coming around every 2 weeks. And the islanders would trade, so they would trade their lobster and seafood and so on, and they would buy meal and grain and things from the bigger islands. But they also had 3 stores on the island, one in the north, one in the middle, and one in the south. And latterly, they had a co-op on the island as well. And one quote that I love, one of the ex-residents said, "You could get everything you might need, from a needle to an anchor," which, if anyone is watching on an island, that's what you need on an island. The mailboat used to come 3 days a week if the weather allowed it, and again, that's a theme we'll see right through all these islands. And they had their own post office on the island as well. One of the other themes that the people focused on a lot was school and the experiences of education. The school had 2 classes on Stroma, the big end and the PD end. And to go to secondary school, as is the case in many communities around not only Scotland but in the world, if you live in a small island community, they had to travel to the mainland for secondary education. So the pupils from Stroma would go to Wick. And there's a lovely memory of pre-telephones, when the time had come at the end of term for the pupils to return to Stroma. They would light a fire on the mainland to signal to the islanders to send a boat to collect the children. Many of the people who lived on Stroma were involved in fishing and crofting, and they, of course, as I said, were self-sufficient, so they grew their own crops, did their own butchering, did their own threshing, and of course there are consequences for that, in that you have to eat what you have, and so there was not a lot of fresh meat. Particularly, one of them said that eating chickens was a great luxury for a special occasion, and that they would travel, breed cattle and travel to Wick to sell them. And that's a huge journey. As I say, it's a dangerous crossing from Stroma to Hoona, and then when they got to Hoona by boat, they would have to walk to Wick with the cattle. And the downside of that is that if the prices are not very good and you get a poor price for your cattle, you still have to accept it, because the cost and the hassle of taking the cattle back to the island would be so substantial. Transport mainly, of course, was by horse and by boat. And there's a fantastic example from one oral history where a child talks about being 6 years old and seeing a helicopter for the first time. Now, that would be frightening to any child at the time, but particularly if you live in a place where you're not seeing a lot of different vehicles. And he describes it, age 6, as seeing a giant spider in the sky. He says he was absolutely terrified by this, but completely fascinated by it. And so he followed it, but he was too scared to come out in the open and watch it. So he's hiding in ditches to try and see this helicopter, this giant spider in the sky. Great story. So islands can often produce strong communities, and still do so. There's our sharing of resources, shared entertainment, and in Stroma they had boat races and events and so on. But something which was always an issue, and in some respects continues to be an issue, is access of things like medical treatment. And so for the residents of Stroma, before there was a nurse on the island, they had to get the boat off Stroma to Hoona, which again I say is a dangerous journey, and then walk to Canis Bay to get to the doctor. And one of the people in the oral history commented that you had to be nearly dying to dare to do it. Another describes the loss of her brother, somebody's brother who had died from a burst appendix because the weather had been too bad to cross to the mainland, and then eventually they'd had to travel the last bit of the mainland by bus. And one of them said it was like going to America. Coming from Stroma to Caithness was like going to America. It was just such a huge journey. And describes a journey on an open boat where they thought it was going to be their last ever journey. So there's a quick and whistle-stop tour into the island of Stroma. But what about the islands on the west coast? Before I come on to tell you about that, just a reminder that these talks are brought to you by High Life Highland, and that they're brought to you by no cost to the viewer. And High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and you don't have any payment or subscription required to watch or take part in these. But if you're able to donate to us, please do so. And there's a link in our Facebook, in this film on Facebook, to be able to do so. So I'm going to move on over now to our Lochaber Archive Centre. Those of you who've watched for several weeks will know we have 4 archive centres around the Highlands. And I'm going now to look at some collections held in Lochaber in Fort William. These include records relating to Elan Shona, which is an island in Loch Moidart, and also records relating to the civil parish of Small Isles, which was also known as Egg and Canna parish. Pre-1891, you'll love this, we love a little bit of local government reorganisation. Pre-1891, the Small Isles were split between Argyllshire and Inverness-shire. Between 1891 and 1975, they were entirely in Inverness-shire. And 1975 was the end of the county system and another reorganisation. So the Small Isles consist of Canna, Rum, Egg, Muck, and some smaller islands as well. These are a particularly beautiful set of islands. They are really, really stunning. Rich in history, rich in wildlife, and in stories, and they still have strong and vibrant communities. And if you're interested in finding out more about the Small Isles, then I really recommend you have a look at their Visit Small Isles website. Really interesting and a great information about how the communities survive and some of the history. So please do have a look at that. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Isle of Canna also have their own archive there, which is the archive collection of John Lorne Campbell and his wife, Margaret Fay Shaw, who donated the island in the end. I'll come on to that in a second. So what's in our collections in Lochaber about these islands? Well, parish-wide, we have records, school boards, we have parish council records and Kirk session records from the late 1800s and the 1900s. And I wanted to give you just a quick overview of some of the collections we have relating specifically to these islands. I'm going to start with the Isle of Egg. So the Isle of Egg was another one similar to Stroma, had been highly populated in the 1841 census, had 546 in the population. So again, as I'm saying, these the census can provide really interesting insights into the population increase and decrease. By 1881, this had fallen quite dramatically to 291, and now it's far fewer than that. And one of the collections we hold in our archives to do with the Isle of Egg is the Isle of Egg Historical Society Photographic Archive. This was created with by the Society with the aim of recording life on Egg. So between 1998 and 2008, over a 10-year period, photographs were gathered and captioned and copied. They have a wide and diverse content. Buildings, people, farming, daily life, social history, ways of existing from the 1800s through to 2000s. We hold copies of these in Lochaber Archive Centre. There are also copies on the Isle of Egg, and there are also copies at Inverness Museum and Art Gallery, so different places that you can get them, and there's also a book published about these images as well. The collection is split into about 60 smaller collections of the people who took these images. Many of them, of course, were people living on the island, and they record specific houses and specific people finding out about their own family members and photographing them or learning about them or sharing their knowledge. Agriculture, occupations, photographs of the violin maker, for instance, occasions like weddings or sales. And there's a picture of the last cattle sale in May 1951. And what I love about these, well, interestingly, the last cattle sale, because they then went on to sell the cattle in Oban, which is very similar to what I was saying in Stroma, that the process of taking the cattle onto the mainland. What I love about this collection is that it's actively collected, consciously collected. Now, a lot of the collections we have obviously come to us through the system of an institution existing or something like that. But what's great about this collection is the fact that it was actively gathered means that it has detail. So there are names, there are dates, there are descriptions, even a description of where a photo was taken on the island, what angle it was looking at, and what can be seen in the background. My colleague Jamie from Ambala, if he is watching, will absolutely back me up in saying that there's nothing more frustrating than getting a load of photos and you don't know where they're from or who's in them. It's a great image, but there's a limited amount that you can do with it if you don't have that information. So this collection is great for having some details of who's the people and the names and the dates. We also hold education records, school logbooks and admission registers for the Isle of Egg, but I'm not going to focus on them because I'm now going to come on and talk about the Isle of Kanna, where I am going to focus on education records. So for the Isle of Kanna, we have collections including the Tom family papers, who were the owners of the estate of Kanna from the late 19th century, and that includes writs and titles and so on. We also have papers relating to the construction of lighthouses in and around these islands. But I wanted to talk to you about some of the education records that we hold relating to Kanna, and I'm going to talk about school logbooks. And the opening entry from the school logbook for Kanna is dated on the 11th of November 1878, and it reads, "Opened school this day with an attendance of 14, most of whom are on the alphabet. No school having been kept here for the last 15 years or thereby, the education of the youth of this parish was passed by during that period." And he goes on to say, the prospects are not very encouraging, he doesn't have very high hopes, and the pupils are unaccustomed to school discipline, but he's resolving to make the best of it. I'm talking about the difficulties of travel to get to islands, but sometimes, again, these difficulties are all relative. And 1893 entry shows the difficulties of travelling in and around the island. And so, for instance, 1893, they talk about the Dorland Plank, which is a bridge that children used to get to school, and it had been removed by fishermen, and therefore the children couldn't get to school. And the following year, the logbook goes on to say the plank has been reinstated, but now the teacher was having to let the class out early so that they could cross the plank before the tide covered it. And that carries on through the school logbooks. There are references to hurricanes and problems crossing, and the bridge was constructed in the 1900s. And similar issues affected, you can see in the school logbooks for Egg. There's an entry from 1924 where a teacher had tried to get back but couldn't because the storm had been so severe that she'd been stranded on the island of Rum, and so school for a week had been chaos because the teacher hadn't turned up. So all of these problems are relative. We also have logbooks for muck and for rum, and we have meteorological records for rum as well. All of the small islands have fantastic plant life and animal life. And rum had been privately owned for a long time, and it hadn't been really visited by tourists. But then in 1957, rum was sold to the Nature. The school, yeah. It had been sold to the Nature Conservancy Council, who then became Scottish Natural Heritage. And so the fact that when they took this over, the island was fairly untouched. And so we have recordings of what they had discovered, meteorological studies and natural surveys from the island, which they had been able to do because it had been untouched. It's interesting that I say that rum is owned by the Scottish Natural Heritage. Kanna is owned by the National Trust for Scotland because, if you remember, I spoke about John Lorne Campbell and his wife, whose archive is in the Kanna House. they donated that island to the National Trust for Scotland. So there's some interesting stories around how those islands are existing now as well. St Kilda is an island that many of you will be familiar with. It's a name that a lot of people know because it was completely evacuated in 1930. St Kilda sits over 40 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, and it's a group of islands. And similar to the other ones that I've spoken about, at one time St Kilda was very self-sufficient, but increasingly was hit by isolation as contact with the outside world increased, and traditional life, the way of surviving traditionally began to decline. And again, similar to many of these others, hit by emigration, by food shortages, by the impact of World War I. And so the numbers of people living on the island of St Kilda gradually declined. And as with all of these, healthcare could be an issue. And there was a time where several young people died in what would be seen on the mainland as unnecessarily, but they hadn't been able to get healthcare in time. And again, frequently in the throes of poor weather, with a lack of fresh meat and a lack of communication, things that had mattered less earlier, but began to be more of a problem. And at their own request, the remaining residents on St Kilda were evacuated in 1930 and resettled on the mainland. And in Lochaber Archive Centre, we have some documents relating to that resettlement process when they came to Morven. And so we have church records that record the name and the new settlement, the new locations. Loch Allen School logbook records new pupils arriving from St Kilda and settling into that community. Finally, and I'm aware I'm absolutely flying through what could be so many more stories, but I'm also very conscious of the time. Coming on to our Skye and Loch Alsh Archive Centre. Now, Skye, of course, itself is an island, but it's certainly not a small island, so I'm not going to talk about Skye. Around Skye, there are various islands, including Pabby, which is in the Inner Sound, Scalpay, which is to the south of Raasay, and the island of Raasay. I'm not going to focus on Raasay today because, although all of these islands have a huge amount of stories, Raasay has a particularly interesting range of stories that we hold in our collection. So I think I'll probably do a separate talk on Raasay. And I may do a separate follow-up on this whole subject because there's just so many interesting things. So what I'm going to talk to you about instead is the island of Skye. So the island of Skye means sheep island, and it's off the southwest coast of Skye. And again, it's in the St Kilda group of islands. And to get to Skye, you have to get a boat from Elgol, which is on the Strathayard Peninsula in Skye. And we hold a range of records relating to Skye, including, again, education records. Now, what's particularly interesting about Skye is at the time of the first statistical account, which is an account of each parish written by the local minister. They're fabulous. If you haven't looked at statistical accounts, please Google them. They're phenomenal. So the 1790s, the time of the first statistical account, Skye was uninhabited. But following the clearances on Skye, crofters were resettled from Skye onto Skye. So in a way, it's the other way around from some of the ones we've talked about. The horrible thing is that they were resettled on Skye because the land there was considered too poor for sheep. So it's too poor for sheep, but it's okay for people. And in the 19th century, the population was about 100 to 160-ish. But like all the other islands I've talked about, gradually emigration caused a problem. And the population dropped and dropped until by the end of the century, it was 78. And as I've said so many times, the census absolutely really, really useful for this collection for finding out these things. So in the late 19th century, the island of Skye had a steamer that used to call in fortnightly. So again, similar to Stroma, the steamer Hebridean came fortnightly. And in the 1890s, the residents petitioned to have their own post office there, and they were successful in that petition. But again, as with everything else I've talked about, that's all weather dependent, and having those institutions in place is great, but it depends on whether or not the weather allows you to use those. But I wanted to tell you the story of Rachel Campbell. Rachel Campbell arrived in Skye in 1912 as the only teacher on the island. She had been a pupil teacher before, had gone to Skye to become the teacher. She was the only breadwinner in her household because her husband was severely crippled with rheumatoid arthritis. and she had 7 children of her own. So if you imagine having a husband who's severely unwell, in addition to 7 of your own children, and being the only person responsible for the education of all these children. And the school had been closed prior to her arrival, and she probably faced similar problems to the teacher who arrived in Kanana, saying that there had been no school for a long time, the children weren't used to discipline, she was starting from a very low level of people not having been educated for a long time. But she was obviously a very successful and excellent teacher, and certainly as Lily Byron and I have talked about before, absolutely essential. You cannot overrate a good teacher. I had a phenomenal history teacher myself, David Taylor, who some of you may be familiar with that name, and you can't beat a good teacher. And Rachel Campbell was obviously a very good teacher, because a report from just a year after she had started, written by the school examiner, Reverend A.J. Macquarie, says, "A happy change has taken place since the examiner visited here some years ago. The children on the roll have quadrupled in number, and the teaching is in bright and intelligent hands." And the logbooks go on to give all sorts of insights into the challenges that Mrs. Campbell must have faced in this school. She talks about pupils being off for whelk gathering. Now, on the mainland, we see a lot of children being called into ploughing or potato digging or potato planting or lifting, all sorts of crop gathering. So whelk gathering on the island of Skye. It talks about measles outbreaks and how the potential that has to devastate a small community. Sickness in her own family and how she's dealing with that while trying to run the school. But I wanted to read you an entry from the 21st of December 1917, where she writes that no pupil came to school today owing to the scarcity of food on the island. The steamer has not called here with food for 6 weeks. And therefore, on the 21st of December, she said, I'm going to make this the New Year's holiday, and we won't come back until after New Year now. But just an insight into that. Yes, it's absolutely idyllic and lovely to live on these islands and to bring your families up on them, but it comes with difficulties, and particularly at these times where you're so reliant on these things. And so he also fell a victim, of course, to emigration and to people leaving, and many of the residents emigrated, and then the remaining residents, most of the remaining residents, asked to be evacuated again at their own request. And it was a gradual decline in population. And it's interesting talking about some of these now are completely evacuated, completely empty and uninhabited. Some still have a handful of people. Some are working incredibly hard to be active and strong communities. So just interesting to see how this has panned out for all these different islands. But you can see shared positives and negatives. Being in an island community can give you a very strong sense of community. And as I say, still very much the case. But it can be a hard life, and it can involve a lot of compromise living on an island. And we see that through the historic records that we look after. So I am going to stop talking, only a few minutes over my time. I hope you have enjoyed finding out about some of these island stories. I think, as I say, I'll probably do a follow-up because there are so many other things to talk about, and I will certainly do an episode purely on Rassie because there's interesting stories there as well. I hope you can join me next week. I'm going to be looking at doing another visit to our asylum collection, which I know is something that always gathers a lot of interest and a lot of compassion, and people are really interested in learning about the history of mental health care. So I hope you can join me for that. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for letting me know where you're watching from and what your purpose is for watching. Like I say, I really appreciate finding out whether it's the community you enjoy or finding out the information or what it is. It's useful for me to know. A reminder before I go that these talks are brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these sessions. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we would appreciate that. And as I say, I will see you next week. In the meantime, all of these films are available on our Facebook page and on the High Life Highland YouTube channel. So please do go back and watch the earlier ones as well. But thank you for joining me, and I will hopefully see you next week.